He stands on the edge of the Bay of Naples, the water shifting beneath a fading afternoon sky, a man once feared across oceans now reduced to a silhouette in exile. Charles Lucky Luciano, once the architect of America's most powerful criminal syndicate, watches the ships come and go from a kingdom that is no longer his. 4 years, New York City moved to the pulse of his decisions. Entire empires rose and crumbled at his command. Yet now, far from the streets that immortalized his legend, he lives out his final chapters in a land that feels both familiar and foreign, embraced by history but abandoned by the world he once ruled. This is the paradox of Luciano's exile: a king forced to leave his throne, an empire severed from its architect, a man left only with ghosts of the world he built. The myth of Lucky Luciano is one of power, brutality, intellect, charm, and ruthless innovation. Few figures in American history transformed organized crime with such precision and foresight. But the story becomes even more profound when the empire slips from his grasp, when every connection that once defined him begins to unravel. It is in this exile, this purgatory between legacy and irrelevance, that his humanity becomes visible. Imagine the same man who once commanded the 5 families of New York now walking the narrow streets of Naples. No bodyguards trailing behind him. No political allies to call in favors. No judges to bribe. No network to deploy at will. In America, Luciano was a force of nature, a strategist, a diplomat, a visionary. But here in Italy, he is just another aging immigrant with stories too dangerous to tell openly. His power exists only in memories whispered behind closed doors, in the rumors of what he might still be capable of. The world remembers him as the boss who streamlined the mafia into a syndicate, but the man standing in exile knows the truth. His empire is alive, yet he can no longer touch it. And that is the emotional center of his final years. He is not broken, far from it. But he is haunted. Haunted by the lights of New York he can never return to. Haunted by the betrayals that pushed him into prison and then into deportation. Haunted by the knowledge that the empire he created continues to thrive without him. Guided by successors who owe their power to him but no longer need him. The story of Lucky Luciano in exile is not just a continuation of the criminal legend. It is a psychological portrait of a man who fought so hard to control the world that he never imagined losing control of himself. He has built a life out of strategy, every friendship carefully chosen, every move calculated, every risk measured. Now, in exile, strategy becomes memory. Control becomes illusion. Influence becomes a shadow. But the fascinating truth is that even in exile, Luciano never fully surrendered. His mind remained sharp, his ambitions simmering beneath the surface. Even oceans away he found ways to connect, communicate, and manipulate the world he left behind. He became a ghostly presence in the international underworld, a whisper of authority, a symbol of the old order that refused to disappear. The question that lingers across every chapter of his exile is simple. Was he still a king without a kingdom, or just an aging relic clinging to the myth of his own invincibility? To answer that, we must journey backward before we move forward. To understand the full emotional weight of his exile, we must return to the streets that shaped him, the era that defined him, the dream he carved out of violence and opportunity. His exile is not just the end of his life, it is the echo of everything that came before. The rise of a boy from Sicily, the hunger created by the unforgiving streets of Manhattan, the alliances forged in blood and loyalty, the empire built with intellect and intimidation, the downfall orchestrated by law enforcement and betrayal. His final years cannot be separated from his beginnings. Every moment of power, every act of manipulation, every friendship and rivalry, all of it collapses into this lonely shoreline where he stands now. History remembers the king. Exile reveals the man. As the waves crash against the harbor beneath him, Luciano knows something that the public does not. Exile is not punishment, it is a mirror. It shows him everything he gained and everything he lost. It forces him to confront the two lives he lived. Salvatore Lucania, the boy who crossed the ocean in search of survival, and Lucky Luciano, the man who dominated that ocean's far shore with a criminal empire unlike anything the world had seen. This documentary is not just the legend of Lucky Luciano. It is the intimate exploration of his transformation, his strategies, his betrayals, his victories, and the slow erosion of everything he once controlled. It is the journey of a man whose name became synonymous with power, and whose ending challenges the myth entirely. Because in exile, power has a different meaning. And as his story unfolds, we discover that the world Luciano created continued to evolve, even as he watched it from afar, powerless to reclaim it. His exile is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a revelation, the true cost of building an empire that outlives its king. Long before the name Lucky Luciano echoed through the streets of New York, the city itself pulsed with a different kind of chaos, raw, unrefined, and primitive. The early 20th century was a time when the criminal underworld lacked structure, discipline, or vision. It was a world built on ethnic boundaries, street brutality, and sheer survival instinct. Immigrant communities fought to carve out spaces in overcrowded neighborhoods where poverty, corruption, and desperation shaped the rhythm of daily life. Each block had its own rules, its own loyalties, and its own dangers. New York was a city of opportunity, but opportunity often came sharpened like a blade. Italian, Irish, and Jewish street gangs moved like independent storms, each with its own methods of extortion, protection rackets, and turf dominance. Battles erupted over the smallest provocation, and disputes were settled not with negotiation but with fists, bullets, and blood. Political machines like Tammany Hall manipulated these gangs, feeding them scraps of power in exchange for votes and favors. Corruption seeped into every level of the city's infrastructure, making law enforcement either complicit or overwhelmed. Crime wasn't a business, it was survival. It was improvisation. It was chaos under the guise of community loyalty. Within this volatile atmosphere, the old world mafia, the so-called mustache Petes, operated with rigid Sicilian traditions. They valued ancestry over innovation, secrecy over strategy, ritual over pragmatism. Their codes were strict, their hierarchies inflexible. They clung to the ways of their homeland, even as America changed around them. Their distrust of outsiders, particularly non-Sicilians, limited their reach. Their refusal to adapt kept them locked in a violent, insular world. In their eyes, business was subordinate to honor, and modernity was a threat, not a tool. Yet the city itself was transforming. Its criminal economy was expanding faster than the old guard could comprehend. Prohibition loomed on the horizon, a national experiment that would soon turn simple bootleggers into millionaires overnight. Money was spilling through the cracks of society, creating possibilities that would reshape organized crime. But before this transformation could take hold, New York remained a battlefield of egos, ethnic rivalries, and outdated thinking. It is within this atmosphere that the story of Lucky Luciano begins to gain context. For Luciano would not simply rise within this world, he would reinvent it. But to understand how ambitious and revolutionary his changes were, one must first understand the disorganized underworld he inherited. The lack of structure meant unpredictable alliances. A man could be your partner one week and your enemy the next. Deals were fragile. Leadership was inconsistent. Territory lines blurred as quickly as they were drawn. Nothing resembled the calculated criminal syndicates that would later dominate American cities. The Jewish gangs, led by figures like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, operated with more flexibility but lacked the generational roots and political traditions of the Italians. Meanwhile, the Irish held power in unions, docks, and saloons, but they too were fragmented, focused on short-term gains rather than long-term dominance. No one had yet imagined a world where these groups might cooperate, strategize, or integrate. Crime at this time had no central brain, only scattered limbs acting independently. This lack of unity created instability. Wars erupted over smuggling routes, illegal gambling dens, or simple territorial pride. The newspapers of the era frequently printed headlines about gang shootings, bombings, and kidnappings. To the public, the underworld was a mosaic of fearsome names and violent incidents. To men like Luciano, men who could see beyond the immediate horizon, it was an inefficient mess, a waste of potential and power. Even the economic landscape of crime was fractured. Without coordination, criminal enterprises competed against each other, cutting into profits and leaving themselves vulnerable to both law enforcement and internal betrayal. Politicians played these rival groups against one another, ensuring no single criminal force grew too powerful. In the eyes of the government, this fragmentation was a blessing. In the eyes of someone like Luciano, it was a flaw begging to be corrected. At the same time, immigrant communities were swelling. Ships unloading at Ellis Island brought families seeking escape from poverty and oppression, only to face an entirely new struggle for identity and survival. These communities brought with them their own traditions, conflicts, and ambitions. On the streets of Manhattan's Lower East Side, cultures blended and clashed in equal measure. Opportunity was everywhere, but so was exploitation. Children grew up fast. Men became hardened early. Respect was currency, reputation was armor. It was in this crucible of corruption, ambition, and cultural collision that the seeds of Luciano's future vision began to form. He observed not just the chaos itself but the reasons behind it. He saw men dying for honor when they could be making fortunes together. He saw rigid leaders resisting change while younger hustlers adapted quickly. He saw a city overflowing with money and opportunity, waiting for someone bold enough to organize the pieces into a single, coherent structure. And before the world would ever hear the name Lucky Luciano, the young Salvatore Lucania absorbed every detail of this fractured landscape. He studied its weaknesses, its rhythms, its vulnerabilities. He watched how different ethnic groups operated, how politicians manipulated power, how fear dictated loyalty. He saw a world stuck between the old ways and the new, a world desperate for transformation but too blind to see it coming. This is the world that existed before Luciano stepped into his destiny. A world of chaos awaiting a strategist. A world of tribal loyalties awaiting a unifying force. A world of violence awaiting order. And when Luciano eventually rose, he would not simply join this world. He would remake it, redefine it, and leave a legacy that outlived every man who underestimated what he was capable of. He was born Salvatore Lucania in Lercarafridi, Sicily, a place defined by poverty, superstition, and the unspoken codes of the old world. His earliest memories were shaped not by comfort but by struggle. In a land where work was scarce and violence was woven into daily life, young Lucania learned the first rules of survival. Stay alert, stay quiet, and understand power long before you possess it. His family, like thousands of others, dreamed of a better future across the ocean, and when he was still a child, their journey began. A journey that would transform him from an unknown immigrant into one of the most influential criminal minds in history. The ship that carried him to America was crowded with families clutching their hopes like fragile baggage. When the skyline of New York finally came into view, it must have looked like a shining promise, a city where anyone could reinvent themselves. But reality waited on the other side of Ellis Island. The Lucania family was filtered, registered, and pushed into the sprawling chaos of Manhattan's Lower East Side, one of the roughest and most overcrowded neighborhoods in the country. Dirty tenements, sweatshops, pickpocket gangs, and street vendors filled every corner of daily life. Opportunity existed, but so did exploitation. Respect was earned not through reputation but through the ability to defend yourself. For Salvatore, now known simply as Charlie, this new world became an unforgiving teacher. He was small, poor, and foreign, easy prey for bullies and rival street kids. But adversity awakened something fierce inside him. He learned English quickly, not from school teachers but from the streets, where insults, threats, and deals were spoken in the rhythm of survival. Every fight toughened him. Every insult sharpened him. Every humiliation fueled a determination to rise above the world that tried to keep him down. By his early teens, Charlie Lucania began assembling a circle of friends who, like him, were hungry, ambitious, and unafraid of danger. Among them were young Jewish kids like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, names that would later become synonymous with power and innovation in organized crime. These friendships were more than alliances, they were forged in the fires of street survival. Where older generations clung to ethnic loyalty, Charlie saw something different. Talent, intelligence, and opportunity existed across cultures. His willingness to form bonds outside his Sicilian roots would ultimately reshape the criminal world. As he drifted deeper into street life, Charlie discovered something else. He possessed an unusual talent for leadership. He wasn't the strongest nor the biggest, but he had a mind built for strategy. He knew when to talk, when to fight, and when to walk away. He understood how fear worked, how respect was built, and how to read a person's intentions before they ever spoke. On the crowded tenement steps and dimly lit alleyways of the Lower East Side, he was learning lessons that no school could teach, lessons that would one day give him the confidence to challenge men far older and more experienced than himself. His early criminal activities were small at first, running errands for local racketeers, delivering packages, acting as lookout. But these minor tasks introduced him to the mechanics of the underworld: bribery, protection schemes, political favors, and the quiet negotiations that kept the streets running. He observed everything. He memorized the faces of important men. He noted who feared whom, who paid whom, who betrayed whom. He listened, absorbed, and prepared. One defining moment in his youth would mark him forever. When he was still a teenager, a group of men abducted him, stabbed him, and left him for dead. The attack was vicious, likely a punishment for refusing to bow to a gang that wanted to extort him. The scars he carried from that night, both the physical ones and the deeper psychological imprint, became part of his legend. And from that incident came the nickname Lucky, though he always claimed the luck was nothing more than survival instinct sharpened to its highest degree. But the name stuck, and so did the reputation. He walked differently afterward, not with arrogance, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had looked death in the eyes and refused to blink. On the streets of New York, that kind of resilience was more powerful than any weapon. Men noticed. Leaders took interest. Doors that were once closed to him began to open. Prohibition arrived like a thunderstorm, transforming petty criminals into wealthy businessmen overnight. For Charlie, it was the opportunity he had been waiting for. The illegal alcohol trade required organization, intelligence, negotiation, and adaptability, skills he possessed in abundance. While older gangsters clung to outdated methods, Charlie saw the industry for what it truly was, a corporate empire waiting to be built. He partnered with the most innovative minds he knew. Lansky brought mathematical precision and financial discipline. Siegel brought fearlessness and charisma. Together, they formed alliances across ethnic lines, a revolutionary move in a world defined by tribal loyalties. Charlie's understanding of people, his ability to persuade, reassure, intimidate, or charm, made him invaluable. He negotiated deals, settled disputes, and cultivated connections with politicians, bootleggers, and established mob bosses. By his early 20s, Charlie Luciano was no longer a street kid struggling for survival. He had become a rising power, a strategist with a vision that stretched far beyond the next shipment of alcohol or the next territorial dispute. While many around him fought for scraps, Charlie was already thinking several steps ahead. He saw the limitations of the old mafia system, the inefficiencies, the pointless feuds, the rigid traditions holding men back. He imagined a world where crime operated like a business, a network coordinated across cities, unified in purpose and capable of generating unprecedented wealth. It was a dream born from the streets that nearly killed him, shaped by the friendships that defied tradition, and fueled by the relentless hunger that had defined him since childhood. The boy from the Sicilian hills had transformed into something new, a visionary molded by hardship, sharpened by danger, and destined to reshape the criminal world entirely. And though he did not yet hold power, his path was set. His evolution from Salvatore Lucania to Lucky Luciano was not just a change of name. It was the birth of a man who would soon command empires, challenge traditions, and rewrite the rules of American organized crime. By the time Prohibition was in full swing, Charlie Luciano had become more than a rising figure. He was a man who could see the future of organized crime with clarity that others lacked. While the old guard clung to their rituals and grudges, Charlie recognized a truth that would reshape history. Crime, like any enterprise, needed structure. It needed vision. It needed a leader who understood not just violence but strategy, diplomacy, and the power of cooperation. The streets were filled with men who could shoot. What they lacked was someone who could think. Luciano had lived long enough under the shadow of the Mustache Petes to understand their weaknesses. They were stubborn, loyal only to Sicily, and unwilling to trust anyone outside their bloodline. Their methods were outdated, predictable, and rooted in a world that no longer existed. They believed honor was the backbone of power. Luciano believed power itself was the backbone of survival. And power, he realized, came from organization, not tradition. He began studying not rival gangs, but the structure of legitimate businesses. How did banks operate? How did corporations divide responsibilities? How were decisions made, profits distributed, and disputes resolved? It was an unconventional approach for a mobster, but that is precisely what made Luciano different. He didn't want to simply control turf, he wanted to build a system, a machine, that could continue operating with or without him. The bloody Castellamarese War, raging between Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, served as the catalyst for Luciano's vision. While both sides fought for dominance, Luciano saw a deeper problem. No matter who won, the future would look exactly like the past. Endless wars, power struggles, ethnic divisions. An empire built on fear alone was destined to collapse. He knew that if the mafia was to survive the modern world, and Prohibition's rivers of money, it needed to evolve. And so he began to build. His first step was assembling minds he trusted, men who were not bound by old-world superstitions but driven by ambition and intelligence. Meyer Lansky became his strategist, the financial architect who could see numbers the way Charlie saw people. Frank Costello became his diplomat, the bridge between criminals and politicians. Bugsy Siegel brought the muscle that could be controlled, directed, and applied with precision. Vito Genovese provided the ruthless, ambitious counterpart whose aggression could be unleashed or restrained as needed. Together they represented something unprecedented, a coalition not defined by ethnicity but by talent. Luciano understood a fundamental truth: the future of organized crime depended on efficiency, not bloodlines. The Jewish gangs excelled in gambling and financial operations. The Italians controlled unions and community protection. The Irish dominated the docks and political access. Why fight for pieces when you could unify the whole? This became the foundation of his grand experiment, the Commission. But long before it had a name or official meetings, Luciano was laying the psychological groundwork. He spent nights negotiating peace between rival factions, persuading hardened gangsters that cooperation meant profit, and profit meant safety. He offered a vision larger than any one family, one era, or one leader. A vision where the mafia operated like a board of executives, each with a vote, each with a stake, each with a seat at the table. The next step was eliminating the obstacles standing in the way of progress. Joe Masuria, tired and blinded by arrogance, refused to accept any system that threatened his personal power. He believed Luciano owed him loyalty, unable to see that the young man standing before him was not the boy he once protected but the strategist who would surpass him. Luciano made the hardest decision of his life, to kill the man who had once been his mentor. It was not betrayal, it was evolution. Months later, Salvatore Maranzano attempted to crown himself the boss of all bosses, recreating the same hierarchical tyranny that Prohibition had rendered obsolete. Luciano knew another war was inevitable. And so Maranzano fell as swiftly as Masuria, paving the way for a new era shaped entirely by Luciano's mind. His reorganization was revolutionary. For the first time, the Italian underworld had a structure modeled on logic rather than tradition. The 5 New York families were formalized, each autonomous, each profitable, each accountable. Murders required approval. Territory disputes were negotiated like corporate mergers. Profits were shared, stabilized, expanded. But the most daring element of Luciano's design was the syndicate, a national network connecting mobsters across cities, states, and even ethnic lines. Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Miami, and Los Angeles all became part of a criminal infrastructure more efficient than most legitimate corporations. The mafia, once fragmented and reactive, became a machine of forward-thinking strategy. Luciano's genius was not merely organizational, it was psychological. He understood the egos of powerful men, the fears that drove loyalty, the insecurities that led to betrayal. He knew when to use money and when to use intimidation. He mastered the art of making enemies feel like partners and partners feel indispensable. His leadership was not built on fear alone but on incentive. As long as everyone benefited, everyone remained loyal. And for a time the system worked flawlessly. Under his guidance, the mafia became invisible to the public eye, operating behind legitimate fronts, influencing politics, manipulating labor unions and controlling industries from the shadows. Gambling, narcotics, construction, shipping. Nothing was off limits. Money flowed in like never before. New York was no longer a battlefield, it was a business capital. Yet in crafting this empire, Luciano also forged the chains of his own downfall. The more organized crime became, the more it attracted attention, from politicians, prosecutors, and media eager to unmask the invisible hand controlling the city. Luciano believed he could outthink the government the same way he outthought rival gangsters. For a while he did. But power has a way of creating blind spots, even for the sharpest minds. Still, in these transformative years, Luciano achieved something extraordinary. He didn't just rise within the underworld, he redesigned it. He created a structure that would outlast him by decades, a system so efficient that even after his imprisonment and exile, it continued to function exactly as he imagined. Every mobster who came after him, willingly or not, lived inside the blueprint he created. From street kid to strategist, from survivor to architect, Lucky Luciano became the man who built not just an empire, but an entire criminal world that would continue long after he was gone. In the world Lucky Luciano built, loyalty was not just a promise, it was a currency more valuable than money, more powerful than violence. It was the invisible thread that held his empire together, binding men through fear, respect, ambition, and something far deeper, a shared understanding of the code that governed their lives. This code, inherited from Sicily yet reshaped in America, hovered like a silent judge over every decision they made. Omerta, the vow of silence, the refusal to betray the brotherhood no matter the cost, was more than a rule. It was a worldview, a way of breathing, a philosophy etched into the soul. To outsiders, Omerta seemed barbaric, a relic of an ancient system. But for men who lived in the shadows of the law, it was the only structure that provided order. It replaced the courts, the police, and any notion of public justice. It became the spine of the underworld, the moral compass in a world where morality was negotiable, yet loyalty was absolute. Luciano understood this better than most, for he had grown up watching how easily alliances crumbled without a code to uphold them. He saw men betray each other for a few dollars, saw friendships dissolve under pressure, watched gangs tear themselves apart from within. If he wanted to build an empire that endured, he needed more than organization, he needed belief. But belief is not forced, it is nurtured. Luciano was a master of understanding human nature. He knew that men require more than fear to stay loyal. Fear fades. Opportunities tempt. Ambition whispers. So he created an environment in which loyalty felt rewarding, where following the code elevated a man's identity. He fostered the sense that being part of his syndicate was not simply a job, it was a brotherhood, a title, a life purpose. Even those who feared him respected him, and those who respected him often came to love him in a way that only power can inspire. Yet Luciano himself was a paradox. He understood loyalty, valued it, demanded it, but he also knew its limits. He trusted few people because he trusted everyone to act in their own interest. Meyer Lansky, perhaps the closest thing he had to a true friend, earned Luciano's confidence not because of sentiment but because their ambitions aligned with rare consistency. Lansky was brilliant, disciplined, emotionally controlled. He never asked for more than he earned, never let ego cloud judgment. He represented the kind of loyalty Luciano cherished. Loyalty rooted in mutual respect, intelligence, and shared vision. With Frank Costello, loyalty came from a different place. Costello was a diplomat, a smooth operator with political instincts unmatched in the underworld. He could walk into a room full of senators and walk out with immunity. Luciano admired this not because it protected him, but because it showed strength through strategy rather than force. Costello was loyal because he understood the stability Luciano created allowed him to thrive. He had no desire to be king. He preferred to be the man who advised one. Others were loyal in different ways. Bugsy Siegel, impulsive and fearless, followed Luciano with the devotion of a younger brother. His loyalty was emotional, burning, unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous. Vito Genovese, on the other hand, masked ambition with allegiance but simmered with envy. Luciano kept him close not because he trusted him completely, but because he understood the psychology of men like Genovese. Dangerous but useful, loyal as long as they saw benefit, treacherous when ambition outweighed gratitude. In this world, loyalty was not black and white. It was a spectrum of motives shaped by fear, respect, love, greed, ambition, and survival. Luciano navigated these shades with skill, rewarding those who stood by the code and eliminating those who violated it. Betrayal, to him, was not just a personal offense, it was a threat to the entire system he built. Every execution ordered, every punishment delivered, was not merely revenge, it was maintenance of order. A cracked foundation spreads weakness. Luciano never allowed cracks. Yet beneath the surface of this cold logic, there was a more human truth. Luciano himself craved loyalty because he had rarely experienced it genuinely. His childhood was marked by instability, bullying, and constant struggle for identity. His early years in the underworld were filled with shifting alliances and dangerous mentors. The attack that earned him the name Lucky taught him early that trust could cost a man his life. So he built a world where trust was engineered, not given, protected by rules, not feelings. Despite this, Luciano's relationships revealed glimpses of vulnerability. He enjoyed companionship, appreciated humor, valued intelligence. With women he was charming but distant, protective but detached. Romance, for him, was temporary relief from the burdens of leadership. His true intimacy existed with the men who shaped his empire, the partners who challenged him, disagreed with him, supported him, and occasionally feared him. Their presence gave him strength and their loyalty gave him power. Omerta defined their interactions, but it also created invisible barriers. It demanded silence even in moments where honesty could have saved lives. It demanded secrecy even among brothers. It demanded suffering without confession, suspicion without explanation, and acceptance without complaint. Luciano lived inside this code, yet he also manipulated it, bending tradition to suit the needs of a modern empire. The psychological weight of the code shaped not only his leadership but his destiny. It made men unbreakable in the eyes of the world, yet it slowly crushed them from within. To break Omerta was to die. To obey it was to lose pieces of oneself, freedom, emotion, vulnerability. Luciano understood this duality intimately. He enforced the code because he needed it, but he also carried the burden of knowing that every man who followed him paid a price for that loyalty. In his world, silence spoke louder than confessions, loyalty mattered more than truth, and betrayal, real or imagined, echoed like a death sentence. And as the empire grew and pressures intensified, the same code that protected him would one day contribute to his downfall, revealing that loyalty in the mafia was powerful but never pure. It was a force that held the kingdom together, and the same force that would eventually pull it apart. The empire Lucky Luciano built did not rise from brutality alone. It rose from business, calculated, organized, and astonishingly profitable business. In the shadows of Prohibition-era America, criminal opportunity grew faster than legitimate industries, and Luciano recognized something that few mobsters before him truly understood. Organized crime could function like a multinational corporation. Illegal enterprises weren't scattered hustles anymore. They were industries waiting to be streamlined, expanded, and controlled. Where earlier gangs saw only risk, Luciano saw potential. Where others saw chaos, he saw structure. And where others fought over scraps, he envisioned a machine that would feed everyone, so long as they followed his vision. Alcohol was the foundation. Prohibition turned liquor into gold, but making money from bootlegging required coordination. Suppliers, transporters, distributors, politicians, and muscle. While rival gangs argued and undercut each other, Luciano worked with Lansky to refine smuggling routes, secure reliable suppliers, and minimize unnecessary violence. They created a network stretching from Canada to New York speakeasies, ensuring that shipments moved smoothly and profits grew steadily. Every link in the chain was controlled, every problem anticipated. Bootlegging didn't just make Luciano rich, it gave him the blueprint for running a criminal empire. But alcohol was only the beginning. Luciano understood that diversification was the secret to unmatched power. Gambling, both legal fronts and hidden dens, became a major expansion. Dice games, card rooms, horse racing, and numbers rackets brought in steady revenue. Meyer Lansky excelled in this world, analyzing odds, managing payouts, and keeping operations efficient. Gambling was less risky than bootlegging and, unlike liquor, didn't depend on national politics. It was timeless, addictive, endless. Then came prostitution, a business Luciano approached with the cold logic of an executive. He despised the chaos and brutality usually associated with the trade, not out of moral concern but because it created instability. So he reorganized it, establishing centralized control, protection systems, medical checks, and regular payments. It became an industry that functioned with operational precision. Ironically, it would later play a significant role in his downfall, but at this stage it was another pillar in his expanding empire. Unions were perhaps the most brilliant piece of the puzzle. Luciano realized early that unions controlled labor, and labor controlled industries. With Costello's political connections and Genovese's intimidation methods, they infiltrated unions across New York. Dockworkers, construction crews, truck drivers, longshoremen, all became assets. Through them, the mafia gained influence over shipments, contracts, and businesses that relied on timely deliveries. If someone refused to cooperate, shipments mysteriously vanished. Buildings stalled halfway through construction. Workers went on strike. The mafia didn't need to fight every battle. They simply controlled the hands that moved the city. Drugs, too, played a role, though Luciano always treated narcotics with caution. He believed drugs attracted too much attention. But he also understood they were profitable, and he was not a man to ignore profit. He allowed limited involvement, tightly regulated, quietly distributed. He created rules, ensuring drugs flowed without sparking unnecessary heat. And when those rules were broken, punishment was swift. Every enterprise, alcohol, gambling, prostitution, unions, narcotics, fit into a larger system. Nothing operated independently. Each business supported the others, generating revenue streams that ran through Luciano's network like veins through a body. Money moved upward, protection moved downward, and loyalty wove the entire structure together. The mafia was no longer a collection of street gangs, it was an economy. Legitimate businesses became tools as well. Restaurants, laundry shops, cab companies, trucking firms, all served as fronts to launder money, store supplies, or conduct meetings. Luciano understood public perception. He wanted the mafia to exist without appearing to exist. Invisible power was the most dangerous kind. Judges, police commanders, union leaders, and politicians became partners. Some willingly, others reluctantly. Bribes replaced threats where possible. Diplomacy replaced violence whenever it achieved the same result at lower cost. Yet beneath this well-oiled machine, an undercurrent of danger always flowed. The bigger the operations became, the more eyes turned toward them. Rival gangs, law enforcement, ambitious prosecutors, and desperate politicians looking for public victories. Luciano believed he could stay ahead, and for years he did. But success carries its own risks. Power creates shadows. And in those shadows, both admiration and resentment grow. Inside the organization, profits created loyalty, but they also created envy. Men like Genovese watched Luciano's rise with a mixture of devotion and hunger. They admired his brilliance but quietly wondered when their moment would come. External threats grew too, aggressive prosecutors eager to prove themselves, reporters hungry for sensational headlines, and moral crusaders determined to wipe out vice from the city. Still, in this era, Luciano's empire operated with such efficiency that even legitimate businesses were forced to respect the mafia's organizational brilliance. Banks, shipping giants, and political machines found themselves dealing indirectly with the influence Luciano commanded. He didn't need to appear in public. He didn't need to give orders loudly. His presence was woven into the fabric of the city itself. New York breathed because he allowed it to. The psychological complexity of Luciano's business mind revealed itself in the way he balanced fear and opportunity. He understood instinctively that men work harder for dreams than they do for demands. So he offered men a place in a vast, profitable world. He made them feel like shareholders in a criminal corporation. Fear ensured obedience. Wealth ensured loyalty. Vision ensured longevity. But the very sophistication that made Luciano untouchable also made him visible. The government could not ignore a criminal empire that operated more effectively than many legitimate institutions. Luciano believed he had time to refine, expand, and stabilize his syndicate. Instead, his innovations accelerated the forces gathering against him. He had built an empire that could run without him, and that was both his triumph and the first whisper of his downfall. For now, though, the machine thrived. Money flowed freely. Streets quieted under unified control. Rivalries faded into cooperation. And Lucky Luciano stood at the center, calm, calculating, and certain that he had mastered the business of crime in a way no one before him had ever imagined. In the empire Luciano built, allies were as essential as currency, and enemies were inevitable. Power attracts partnerships, but it also breeds resentment, ambition, and fear. Lucky Luciano understood that leadership in the underworld was not simply about building an empire, it was about managing the personalities capable of destroying it. Every man around him carried potential to elevate the syndicate or potential to fracture it. And in a world where trust was both necessary and dangerous, Luciano navigated alliances like a grandmaster plays chess, strategically, preemptively, and with absolute awareness of the stakes. Meyer Lansky was perhaps the most important ally Luciano ever had. Their friendship began on the rough streets of the Lower East Side, but it evolved into something deeper, an unspoken partnership built on respect rather than dominance. Lansky brought stability to Luciano's ambition. Where others saw only profit, Lansky saw patterns. He could calculate risk the way others counted money. He understood the psychology of gambling, the mathematics of odds, and the necessity of discipline. Luciano admired that level of control. With Lansky he shared something rare in the underworld: equality. They balanced each other, Luciano with vision, Lansky with logic. Frank Costello was another pillar of this alliance network. Known as the Prime Minister, Costello's influence stretched through political circles with quiet sophistication. While Luciano understood people, Costello understood institutions. He knew which politicians needed money, which judges needed favors, and which police captains needed to look the other way. His gift was subtlety, he could move mountains without ever lifting his voice. Luciano trusted him because Costello represented stability. He had no desire for the top seat. He preferred the shadows where real influence lived. Then there was Bugsy Siegel, bold, impulsive, charismatic, and dangerous in the way fire is dangerous. Siegel was loyal like a brother, but volatile like a loaded gun. He acted from emotion, not calculation. Luciano valued that loyalty, that raw courage, that willingness to step into danger without hesitation. Yet he also understood the risk inherent in Siegel's nature. One wrong move, one moment of uncontrolled violence, could unravel carefully negotiated truce lines. Still, Luciano kept him close, both out of affection and because a man like Siegel could accomplish things no strategist could. When fear needed a face, Siegel provided it. Vito Genovese stood on the other end of the psychological spectrum. Ambitious, cunning, resentful, and quietly hungry for power, he was both an ally and a threat. Luciano recognized his usefulness. Genovese was ruthless, efficient, and unapologetically direct. But he was also unpredictable in a way that differed from Siegel. Siegel's unpredictability came from emotion. Genovese's came from ambition. He masked envy with loyalty, but Luciano saw beyond the smile. He knew Genovese was the kind of man who waited patiently for opportunities, who measured a leader's weakness, who counted the days until power shifted. Keeping him close wasn't trust, it was control. These allies formed the backbone of Luciano's new order. Each brought something essential: intelligence, diplomacy, brutality, or ambition. Together, they stabilized an underworld that had been fragmented for generations. But unity always has a cost. And for every alliance Luciano nurtured, an enemy waited in the wings. The mustache Petes, the old-world bosses, resented Luciano for his modern ideas, his integration with Jewish and Irish mobsters, and his disregard for Sicilian tradition. Men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano saw him as a threat to their authority. They believed their rules were sacred. Luciano believed their rules were obsolete. Their hatred wasn't just personal, it was ideological. Luciano represented the future they feared, a world where power was shared, not hoarded, where business trumped ancestry, where alliances crossed cultural lines, where the mafia became an American institution rather than a Sicilian relic. Even after Luciano orchestrated the deaths of both Masuria and Maranzano, the threat did not disappear. It shifted. New rivals emerged, men with their own visions, their own ambitions, their own ideas about how the underworld should operate. Some envied Luciano's alliances. Others feared them. Some envied his success. Others feared his potential. Luciano had unified the mafia, but unity created something the old guard had never dealt with: a centralized target. As his empire grew, so did the desire to challenge it. Law enforcement became an equally formidable enemy. Prosecutors saw Luciano not just as a criminal, but as a symbol, the embodiment of organized crime's evolution. Bringing him down would mean more than disrupting a racket. It would mean dismantling a system. Men like Thomas E. Dewey built careers on the mission to destroy Luciano's empire. The more sophisticated his operations became, the more determined his enemies became to expose them. Yet Luciano understood something essential. In the criminal world, enemies could be converted. Negotiation was as effective as intimidation. A carefully placed bribe could turn a threat into an asset. A strategic show of force could silence a rebellion. A quiet talk in a backroom could save thousands of dollars in bloodshed. Luciano's ability to read men, to sense fear, ambition, pride, allowed him to navigate conflicts before they erupted. He didn't seek unnecessary wars, he prevented them. His genius wasn't in killing rivals but in neutralizing them. Still, no alliance lasted forever. Loyalty shifted with circumstances. Ambition grew and mutated. The very men who helped Luciano rise would one day reshape the world he left behind. Some would honor his legacy. Others would undermine it. Some would protect his empire. Others would claim it. And in the shadows of every friendship, every handshake, every whispered conversation, the question lingered: who can be trusted and for how long? Luciano's greatest strength was building alliances that expanded his reach beyond any crime boss before him. His greatest challenge was maintaining those alliances in a world where loyalty was conditional, trust was fragile, and ambition was eternal. Because in the end, allies and enemies were often the same men, distinguished only by timing, opportunity, and the shifting balance of power. The underworld Luciano helped shape was never truly peaceful. Even with the commission in place, even with alliances carefully balanced and territory meticulously divided, the mafia existed in a permanent state of quiet warfare. It was a war without front lines, fought in whispers rather than gunfire, where strategy mattered more than bullets and survival depended on seeing threats before they surfaced. Beneath the polished structure of Luciano's syndicate, a hidden war pulsed. A war of influence, manipulation, fear, and survival. The Castellamarese War had ended, but its scars lingered across the criminal landscape. Old loyalties still simmered, rivalry still festered, and ambitious men waited for the smallest opportunity to tilt the balance of power in their favor. Luciano's reforms created order, but order can never erase hunger. Some men wanted more. Some resented the new rules. Others believed they were destined to become the next great leader of the mafia. And all of them watched Luciano with equal parts admiration and suspicion. Internal threats surfaced first. Vito Genovese, aggressive and calculating, grew restless beneath Luciano's leadership. He obeyed the rules, but his eyes always scanned the horizon, looking for weaknesses. His ambition was a quiet storm, predictable in its inevitability, unpredictable in its timing. Luciano recognized it. So did Lansky. They knew Genovese followed the system only because the system benefited him. The moment it didn't, the moment he saw an opening, he would strike. Yet Luciano kept him close because proximity was control. Distance was danger. Beyond internal tension, rival factions across the country posed their own challenges. Chicago, under Al Capone's empire, was powerful but volatile. Detroit had its own alliances. Philadelphia, Cleveland, and New Orleans each operated with varying degrees of independence. Luciano's syndicate functioned like a federation, but not everyone wanted to follow federal rule. Some preferred chaos. Chaos gave them space to rise. And while Luciano mediated disputes, brokered deals, and maintained fragile unity, a greater threat grew quietly in the background: law enforcement. Unlike rival gangsters, law enforcement did not operate on ego or profit. Their motivations were moral, political, and public. Prosecutors saw Luciano as the face of modern organized crime, and bringing him down became a symbolic mission. It wasn't just about stopping his rackets, it was about proving the government could defeat a criminal genius. The most formidable of these adversaries was Thomas E. Dewey, a relentless, ambitious prosecutor who built his reputation on dismantling criminal enterprises piece by piece. Dewey didn't rely on bribes, didn't fear threats, and wasn't seduced by power. He was immune to the tools Luciano typically used to manage threats. And that made him dangerous. Dewey launched a wave of investigations targeting the mafia's core operations: prostitution rings, gambling networks, union manipulations, and political corruption. He studied the syndicate like a machine, analyzing its structure, identifying its weak points, and striking systematically. His raids disrupted the delicate balance Luciano worked so hard to establish. Arrests shook lower-level operators. Informants appeared where none had existed before. Loyalties wavered under pressure. For the first time, Luciano felt the walls begin to close in, not from the inside but from a force he could not negotiate with. But even as Dewey tightened the noose, another hidden war raged beyond New York. International conflicts brewed in Europe and Asia. Smuggling routes intertwined with political shifts. Criminal networks in Italy, Cuba, and South America began linking operations with American syndicates. Luciano found himself balancing not just internal unity but global influence. His empire was expanding faster than any single man could control, and expansion always created vulnerability. In the shadows of all this, the psychological war intensified. Luciano understood that perception was as important as reality. A leader who appeared weak invited rebellion. So he projected confidence, stability, and control, even when events threatened to overwhelm him. He reassured allies, punished threats, and maintained order with the calm authority of a man who believed he had mastered every scenario. Yet moments of private doubt existed. In quiet rooms behind closed doors, he confided in Lansky, sometimes not with words, but with silence heavy enough to reveal concern. He knew the commission could stabilize disputes but couldn't erase human ambition. He knew Dewey could be slowed but not bribed. He knew Genovese was watching for the moment he faltered. Luciano thrived on strategy, but even the most brilliant strategist cannot predict everything. The hidden war also changed the nature of the streets. Violence became more selective. Killings were no longer displays of dominance, they were executions of necessity. The mafia evolved into a more sophisticated organism, but sophistication required more discretion, more secrecy, more psychological control. Luciano's ability to sense tension before it turned into violence became his greatest asset. He would call meetings to soothe tempers, offer profits to dissolve disputes, or threaten quietly when diplomacy failed. Still, every solution planted the seeds of future conflict. Every alliance was temporary. Every peace was fragile. And every victory drew attention. As the government intensified its crackdown, Luciano's empire began to feel the strain. Raids disrupted revenue. Arrested operators talked under pressure. Newspapers exposed connections that were once invisible. Public opinion shifted. Politicians demanded action. And Dewey, relentless in his pursuit, moved closer to building a case strong enough to challenge Luciano's seemingly untouchable reign. This hidden war, internal and external, became the turning point. Luciano was still powerful, still respected, still feared. But he was no longer invincible. The system he built was strong, yet even the strongest systems have points of fracture. His enemies were learning, adapting, organizing, just as he once had. And as pressure intensified, Luciano did what he had always done. He adapted. But adaptation for the first time required more than strategy. It required sacrifice. It required reform. And it required acknowledging that the empire he built was becoming larger than the man who created it. Soon, the hidden war would erupt into open confrontation. Soon the government would strike harder. Soon betrayal, both expected and unexpected, would surface. The foundation of his empire would tremble. And Lucky Luciano, the man who built order from chaos, would find himself facing a new kind of chaos, one he could neither escape nor fully control. Pressure does not break a man like Lucky Luciano all at once. It builds slowly, tightening like a rope around the empire he spent years constructing. The fall never begins with a loud collapse. It begins with whispers, with shadows shifting in the background, with the subtle erosion of control that even the sharpest mind cannot immediately detect. For Luciano, the beginning of the end was not one moment, but a series of small fractures forming beneath the surface of his powerful facade. The public saw only his confidence, his tailored suits, his calm smile in photographs, his reputation as the man who controlled New York without ever needing to raise his voice. But beneath that certainty the web around him was tightening. Thomas E. Dewey's relentless pursuit had already disrupted major operations, but now the pressure turned personal. Dewey was no longer targeting organized crime. He was targeting Lucky Luciano by name, by reputation, by myth. And Luciano understood the danger of becoming the face of a movement. A faceless empire is hard to attack. A symbol, however, is easy for the public to rally against. Dewey took aim at the weakest link in Luciano's empire, the prostitution rings. Luciano had always treated prostitution as just another business, cold, regulated, profitable. But prostitution was messy, emotionally charged, rife with potential informants, and easy for newspapers to sensationalize. Dewey knew that attacking the syndicate through the women who worked in it would bypass Omerta entirely. Many of them had no loyalty to the mafia, no honor code to protect, no personal bond with Luciano. They had survived trauma, exploitation, and fear. And when faced with a choice between prison and cooperation, some saw cooperation as the only path. One after another, witnesses came forward. Some coerced, some manipulated, some eager to shift blame upward to save themselves. Their stories were inconsistent, contradictory, often exaggerated. But consistency was not necessary, public outrage was. Dewey masterfully crafted their testimonies into a narrative of exploitation and control, painting Luciano as the mastermind behind a sprawling vice network. Whether the narrative was entirely accurate mattered less than the fact that it was compelling. And once the public embraced it, the machinery of law and politics followed. But the external pressure was only half the story. The internal fractures were far more dangerous. Within Luciano's own ranks, ambition was stirring. Men who once thrived under his leadership now began calculating what his fall might mean for them. Vito Genovese, always waiting, always watching, saw an opportunity in Dewey's crusade. If Luciano was arrested, or even weakened, Genovese could step forward into the vacuum. He had already begun quietly distancing himself, subtly positioning himself as a necessary figure in the event of upheaval. Others too sensed a shift in the air. Allies who had always stood firmly beside Luciano now hesitated. They still respected him, still feared him, but fear of the government was growing stronger. Prohibition was ending, revenue streams were changing, and the world Luciano once controlled so effortlessly was evolving rapidly. Men who depended on him for leadership were now wondering whether he could still protect them. Through it all, Luciano remained outwardly composed. He attended meetings, managed disputes, adjusted strategies, and continued to project the calm authority that defined him. But in private, the tension was unmistakable. Lansky urged caution. Costello warned of political momentum building against them. Even Bugsy Siegel sensed danger, though his instinct was to confront it with violence, an option Luciano dismissed immediately. The reality was simple: you cannot shoot your way out of a legal war. As arrests mounted, Luciano began noticing something he had never seen before: hesitation in the eyes of men who once executed his orders without question. A pause too long during a conversation. A subtle shift in tone. A question asked that shouldn't have been asked. Fear changes people. It distorts loyalty, blurs judgment, and plants seeds of betrayal. The true blow came when whispers surfaced that some individuals within his prostitution network were claiming Luciano personally directed operations. These accusations were absurd from a business standpoint. Luciano was too high up to involve himself directly. But perception was now more powerful than truth. The newspapers ran headlines calling him the Vice King, a theatrical title that fed public imagination. Dewey used the momentum to build a case strong enough to arrest him. When Luciano finally learned that an indictment was imminent, he refused to run. Running was weakness. Running would confirm guilt. Running would diminish his legacy. Instead, he traveled to Hot Springs, Arkansas, believing the distance would buy him time to strategize. But Dewey anticipated the move and pressured authorities nationwide. Luciano was arrested, paraded before the press like a trophy, a symbol of law enforcement triumph. For the first time in his life, Lucky Luciano looked like prey instead of predator. But even as the legal machinery closed in, the deeper betrayal had already begun. Some of the very people who benefited most from Luciano's empire now saw an opportunity to save themselves, or to rise in his absence. The women who testified against him accused him of being the central figure behind the entire vice operation. Lower-level racketeers hinted at his involvement, even if they had never met him. Informants embellished stories to please prosecutors. Each lie, each exaggeration, each half-truth was another thread in the net tightening around him. Inside the commission, the atmosphere shifted. No one openly challenged Luciano, but the silence spoke volumes. Power hates uncertainty. And Luciano, once the embodiment of control, was now surrounded by it. This was the beginning of his fall, not the dramatic collapse the world imagines, but the quiet unraveling of a man trapped between loyalty and survival, between truth and perception, between the empire he built and the cracks forming beneath it. The world was changing. The law was closing in. And the men around him were beginning to calculate futures that no longer included Lucky Luciano at the center. The courtroom became a stage, and Lucky Luciano, once the quiet architect of America's criminal underworld, was thrust into the spotlight as its unwilling star. For years, he had operated behind the curtain, pulling strings so subtly that most people never even saw his hand. But now, every eye in the country was fixed on him. Newspapers called him the king of vice, the shadow boss, the mastermind behind America's sin. Headlines were written not as journalism but as entertainment. Luciano understood better than anyone that perception shapes truth, and now perception was spiraling out of his control. When he entered the courtroom for the first time, the room stiffened. Reporters leaned forward. Spectators whispered. Even seasoned prosecutors glanced up with a mix of curiosity and determination. Luciano walked slowly, calmly, dressed impeccably as always, not because the suit mattered but because dignity mattered. He refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing fear. Fear, in his world, was a weapon, and he would never allow it to be used against him. Thomas E. Dewey stood on the opposite side of the room, ready not just to try a criminal, but to dismantle a legend. Dewey wasn't driven by personal vendetta. He was driven by ambition, moral certainty, and the belief that America's legal system needed a victory as symbolic as it was practical. Taking down Luciano would not only weaken organized crime, it would bolster Dewey's rising political star. The trial was more than justice. It was theater. It was politics. It was a battle of narratives. Luciano's lawyers argued that the case against him was flimsy, built on inconsistent testimonies and coerced statements from vulnerable women. And they were right. The evidence was circumstantial at best, fabricated at worst. But Dewey didn't need perfection. He needed a story, and he delivered one with precision. He presented Luciano as the puppeteer controlling a vast prostitution network, using fear and violence to force women into compliance. The witnesses, though unreliable, carried emotional power. Their tears, their trembling voices, their desperation, all of it fed the public's hunger for drama. Luciano listened quietly as accusations poured over him like acid. The stories were often exaggerated, sometimes impossible, but always damaging. He knew that fighting each detail would be pointless. The courtroom had become a battlefield of emotions, not facts. Logic was secondary to spectacle. Every lie sharpened Dewey's sword. Every inconsistency strengthened the narrative. Luciano watched the jury, not the witnesses. He saw their reactions, their discomfort, their moral outrage. He could feel the tide turning, slowly but steadily. The most painful part of the trial wasn't the accusations, it was the betrayal embedded within them. Some witnesses claimed they had met him when they hadn't. Others insisted he directed operations he barely knew existed. But the only testimony that carried true weight came from within his own network. Men who had once sworn loyalty. Men who had once profited from his protection. Men who now stood in the courtroom, shifting nervous glances, hoping cooperation would reduce their own sentences. Loyalty was crumbling, not in grand acts of treachery, but in quiet confessions offered in exchange for survival. This was the part of the trial that struck Luciano hardest. The realization that the code he had enforced with such discipline was weaker in the face of prison bars than he had believed. Omerta was absolute until fear entered the heart. And fear was the one weapon Dewey wielded more effectively than Luciano ever could. As the trial progressed, the media frenzy intensified. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily, demanding justice for crimes they didn't fully understand. The story had captured public imagination, a criminal emperor brought to his knees by the law. It was Shakespearean. It was biblical. It was the clash of power and morality that audiences craved. Luciano, who had remained invisible for so long, was now being displayed like a rare animal behind glass. His lawyers fought fiercely, challenging witness credibility, exposing inconsistencies, highlighting lack of physical evidence. But Dewey countered with charisma and unshakable confidence. He painted Luciano not as a man, but as a symbol of everything corrupt in American society. The jury wasn't evaluating crime, they were evaluating morality. And in that arena, Luciano had already lost. The turning point of the trial came not from evidence, but from spectacle. Dewey delivered a closing argument that transformed the proceedings into a moral crusade. He portrayed Luciano as a predator, preying on women and society alike. The courtroom fell silent as Dewey spoke, his voice measured, dramatic, righteous. Even those who doubted aspects of the case felt the emotional weight of his words. When Dewey finished, the jury didn't just look convinced, they looked relieved as if justice had already been delivered. Luciano remained calm when the verdict was read. Guilty. 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 Multiple counts. Multiple sentences. A total of 30 to 50 years. The courtroom erupted. Dewey became an instant national hero. Reporters rushed to capture Luciano's reaction, but he simply gave a faint, indifferent smile, the smile of a man who refused to let the world see pain. Inside, however, he felt something deeper than anger. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defeat. It was clarity. He understood that the law had not beaten him because he was careless or ruthless or unprepared. He was beaten because the world had changed. The system he built had grown large enough to expose itself. His innovations had brought the mafia out of the shadows, and the spotlight had destroyed him. As he was escorted away in handcuffs, flashing cameras lighting his path, Luciano knew the next chapter of his life would not be written in the streets or the boardrooms of power. It would be written behind bars, where influence was limited, where alliances were distant, where every door closed instead of opened. But even as the cell door slammed shut, Luciano did not consider the story over. Power can be reshaped. Influence can move through walls. And a man like Luciano never stops thinking. Prison was meant to be the end of a man like Lucky Luciano. For most crime bosses, a cell was the final betrayal, the moment when the world stripped away their influence, their authority, their myth. But Luciano was not like most men. Walls did not confine his mind. Bars did not silence his voice. In a world designed to crush power, he found new ways to exercise it. If the streets had once been his kingdom, then prison became his office. He adapted, not by force but by intellect. When he first arrived at Dannemora, the guards watched him with suspicion, expecting arrogance or defiance. Instead, they found a man who moved with calculated calm. Luciano didn't fight the system, he studied it. He learned the routines, the hierarchies, the unofficial economy that governed prison life. He observed how inmates interacted, what leverage existed, which guards were greedy, which ones could be swayed. Prison was a microcosm of the outside world, and in microcosms, power could always be reorganized. At first, the inmates kept their distance. Some feared him. Others resented him. But over time, fear turned into curiosity. Luciano wasn't boastful. He didn't demand respect. He simply behaved like a man who did not belong in a cage, and that, paradoxically, made everyone look to him for guidance. When fights broke out, he diffused tension. When conflicts threatened order, he mediated. He was not the strongest man in the yard, but he was undoubtedly the most composed. His influence didn't come from violence, it came from presence. Word spread among prisoners that Luciano understood how to get things done. A request for protection. A negotiation between rival groups. A minor favor from a guard. Luciano became the silent problem solver. The man whose nod meant safety, whose silence meant decisions had already been made. The prison began to revolve around his psychological gravity. But even as he built this quiet authority, Luciano's mind never drifted far from the outside world. His empire continued without him, guided by the structure he had created. The five families still operated. The commission still mediated. Lansky and Costello remained the intellectual pillars. But the world was changing fast. Prohibition had ended. New criminal markets were emerging. Narcotics were expanding. Politicians were becoming bolder. And rivals like Genovese waited for chance and timing. Luciano could not walk the streets, but he could still influence them. Visits from lawyers became more than legal consultations. They became communication channels. Notes passed quietly. Messages disguised as legal strategy. In the shadows of prison windows and attorney-client privilege, the underworld still heard his voice. Meanwhile, guards, some loyal to the payoffs offered by his associates, ensured communication flowed in and out with minimal scrutiny. Even behind bars, Luciano remained a participant in the American Mafia's evolution. Prison, ironically, gave Luciano something he had not experienced in years: time. Time to think, time to reflect, time to understand the deeper cost of the life he had built. He realized that, although he created an empire designed to function without him, he had never prepared for the emotional vacuum that came with losing direct control. It wasn't the money he missed. It wasn't even the danger. It was the decision-making, the intangible thrill of shaping outcomes, guiding movements, influencing men. In prison he had influence, yes, but it was a different kind. Smaller. More contained. It was nothing compared to the weight of his old world. Then came World War II, and with it an unexpected twist of fate. The U.S. government found itself facing a new threat: German submarines attacking American ships along the East Coast. Ports were vulnerable, dockworkers unreliable, and intelligence scarce. Rumors circulated that sabotage might be emerging from within the docks themselves. The Navy needed cooperation from the unions, from the longshoremen, from the men who controlled the waterfront. And through a chain of influence that surprised even the government, that control traced back to Luciano. Naval intelligence agents approached him cautiously. At first, the idea seemed absurd. Ask a convicted crime boss for help in a national war effort? But desperation makes strange allies. Luciano listened, silent, expression unreadable. He understood the opportunity immediately. Helping the government wasn't a moral choice, it was a strategic one. Cooperation meant leverage. Leverage meant possibility. And possibility meant hope for freedom. He gave his support. Quietly. Efficiently. Through intermediaries. The dock stabilized. Intelligence improved. Sabotage fears diminished. The government, unwilling to publicly acknowledge the arrangement, nevertheless recognized Luciano's value. Power, even in prison, had found him again. This collaboration became the foundation for the deal that would later lead to his deportation rather than continued imprisonment. But in the moment, it also reaffirmed something he always believed. Influence is not tied to geography. It is tied to relevance. And as long as the world needed something only he could provide, he would never be insignificant. Still, prison life carried its psychological cost. Nights were long. Silence pressed heavily against the soul. Memories haunted him. New York streets glowing under neon lights, laughter spilling out of clubs he once controlled, the faces of allies who now shaped the world without him. Luciano learned that the absence of freedom is not measured in locked doors but in the loss of movement, the loss of spontaneity, the loss of being able to act upon one's own ideas. And yet he endured. Not because he was unbreakable but because he knew he still had chapters left to write. His empire might have moved on, but it had not forgotten him. His enemies might have celebrated, but they could not erase him. His past had taken him prisoner, but his mind was already shaping its next escape. Behind those walls, he was neither defeated nor idle. He was waiting, thinking, planning. Because Lucky Luciano understood something few men in history ever learn. A prison cell can contain a body. It cannot contain a legacy. It cannot silence a mind. And it cannot extinguish a man who has built power that stretches beyond walls. Freedom did not come to Lucky Luciano as redemption, it came as exile. After years behind bars, after quiet negotiations shaped by wartime necessity, the government granted him something that felt less like mercy and more like a verdict. Release from prison, but only on the condition that he leave the country he had shaped, ruled, and defined. America, the land that transformed Salvatore Lucania into Lucky Luciano, now wanted him gone. When he stepped out of the prison gates and felt open air on his face again, it was not victory. It was displacement. Authorities escorted him onto a ship bound for Italy, a place he had left as a child and never intended to return to. The skyline of New York, his New York, faded behind him like a ghost he could never touch again. He stood on deck, surrounded by officers and reporters, pretending to be unmoved. But inside he felt something deeper than loss. He felt the collapse of identity. The empire he built still stood, but he no longer had the right to walk its streets. He had designed a machine that could run without him, but he had never imagined being forced to watch it from afar. When he arrived in Naples, crowds gathered out of curiosity. Some saw him as a legend returned to the old country. Others saw him as an Americanized outlaw who no longer belonged anywhere. Italy, ravaged by war, offered none of the glamour or opportunity Luciano once commanded. Poverty filled the streets, corruption simmered beneath every institution, and the political landscape was chaotic. Luciano stepped into this world as a man both recognized and foreign, Sicilian by birth but American by fate. He tried to carry himself with dignity, but exile is a psychological wound that bleeds slowly. He walked through Naples with the grace of a man trying to remember who he once was. In his old homeland he found echoes of his childhood, but none of the purpose that once fueled him. He had power, yes, but it was abstract now, whispers of influence, memories of authority, shadows of decisions made years ago. Yet men like Luciano do not fade quietly. Even from exile he began to restore connections. Visitors from America arrived discreetly. Old allies sent messages. New associates sought his blessing. Europe's criminal networks recognized the value of his experience, his name, his strategic mind. Soon, whispers spread across Italy, Sicily, and beyond. Luciano was not finished. He might have been removed from America, but he had not been removed from the world. Still, he struggled with the emotional weight of exile. For a man who once controlled the rhythms of New York, Italy felt slow, smaller, bound by old traditions he had long outgrown. He missed the noise, the deals, the constant energy. He missed the feeling of walking through crowds knowing every corner belonged to him. In Naples he was observed, not obeyed. But then came an opportunity that reignited his ambition: Cuba. Havana was emerging as the new playground for international gambling, narcotics distribution, and political corruption. Lansky was building something extraordinary there: casinos, hotels, networks that linked American mobsters with European suppliers and Caribbean politicians. Luciano saw in Cuba what he had once seen in New York: a frontier, a chance to reclaim relevance, a chance to build again. In 1946, he traveled to Havana under the guise of business negotiations. But it was more than business, it was a resurrection. The moment he stepped into the tropical heat, he felt alive again. The city pulsed with music, money, and opportunity. Lansky greeted him not as a fallen king, but as a returning architect. Meetings were arranged. Plans were drafted. Once again, Luciano found himself surrounded by men seeking guidance, approval, strategy. For a brief, exhilarating period he was back. Not fully, not openly, but enough to feel purpose. Enough to feel the weight of leadership settle onto his shoulders again. Havana became the heartbeat of a new empire, one that connected continents, markets, and syndicates. Luciano's name traveled through networks like a spark, rekindling influence he thought was lost forever. But power, as always, attracted attention. The U.S. government learned that Luciano was operating out of Cuba and pressured Cuban authorities to expel him. The dream ended swiftly. In early 1947 he was forced onto a plane and returned to Italy, this time with no illusions. Exile for the second time was final. America did not want him. Cuba could not protect him. And Italy, beautiful, ancestral, nostalgic Italy, could never feel like home. Back in Naples, Luciano confronted the truth he had avoided for years. No matter how influential, respected, or feared he remained, he was now living a life defined by memory rather than momentum. His empire flowed through channels he created, but he no longer held the steering wheel. As he aged, he developed a strange mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride in what he had built. Sorrow in what he had lost. His nights grew quieter. His mornings slower. He reflected on the young boy who arrived in New York desperate for survival, the young man who challenged the old guard, the mastermind who unified the underworld. Now he was simply Charlie again, a man walking streets that did not recognize his footsteps. But exile also changed him. It softened the edges of his ambition. It made him reflect on loyalty, betrayal, power, and purpose. He began to see the difference between influence and attachment, between leadership and legacy. The empire no longer needed him to function, and in that strange, painful realization he found something like peace. He had built something that outlived him. Exile had taken his presence, but not his impact. And as his final years approached, Luciano understood that he could no longer return to the kingdom he once ruled. But he could still define how the world remembered him. Not as a man broken by exile, but as a man transformed by it, a king without a throne who learned finally what it meant to be human. Exile may have taken Luciano out of America, but it never took America out of him. Even in Italy, even as age crept upon him, even as governments monitored him and rivals plotted without him, he remained what he had always been: a strategist searching for a new angle, a new frontier, a new place to exert influence. He could no longer command the streets of New York, but he could still guide the flows of money, the movements of men, and the shaping of criminal worlds that stretched across oceans. The Exile became his second arena, the stage where he attempted one final gambit to reclaim purpose, relevance, and control. Italy offered limited opportunity. The post-war world was fractured, corrupt in new ways, rebuilding in others. Crime existed everywhere, but it lacked structure and vision. Luciano recognized familiar patterns, different players, same desperation. Yet he also sensed danger. Italy was watched closely by American intelligence, by the Italian government, and by rival factions that saw him as both legend and threat. He needed a place where he could operate freely, discreetly, and profitably. A place outside the shadows of his past. And that place revealed itself in the Caribbean, in the sultry, electric promise of Havana. Havana was unlike anything he had seen since New York. It pulsed with life. Money flowed freely through casinos, nightclubs, and luxury hotels. Politicians could be bought with a handshake. Police could be silenced with a glance. Tourists poured in, seeking indulgence. And behind it all, Meyer Lansky was constructing a new empire, an empire built on gambling, tourism, and political partnerships. Lansky needed someone with vision. Luciano needed a kingdom, even if it wasn't his old one. Their interests aligned as naturally as they had on the streets of New York decades earlier. When Luciano arrived in Havana, it was as if a part of him reawakened. The humidity clung to his skin, the music vibrated in his bones, and the energy reminded him of the New York nightlife he once owned. But this time he was older, sharper, more cautious. He moved through cigar-filled casino halls like a ghost with authority, visible yet untouchable. Younger mobsters looked at him with awe. Politicians approached him with respect. Lansky welcomed him as a partner, not a relic. Meeting after meeting took place in suites overlooking the ocean. Luciano listened, advised, mediated disputes, and approved expansion strategies. He didn't need to be the boss in name. His presence alone was shaping decisions. The Havana Conference of 1946 became a symbolic return to power. Representatives from crime families across America gathered not just to hear Lansky's plans, but to acknowledge Luciano's influence. Even men who had risen in his absence treated him like a founding father. And in many ways he was. But his renewed power came with consequences. Word spread quickly through American intelligence communities that Luciano, America's most famous deported gangster, was operating freely in Havana. This was unacceptable to U.S. officials who feared his influence could destabilize markets, politics, or even national security. Pressure mounted on Cuban leaders. Behind closed doors, deals were threatened, favors revoked, and consequences spelled out. Cuba, caught between its dependence on American tourism and its loyalty to mob-backed investments, made its choice. Luciano was ordered to leave. The expulsion felt like a blade twisting in old wounds. Once again he was torn away from a world he had begun to rebuild. Once again he was placed on a plane headed back to Italy, this time under far harsher scrutiny. His dreams of a Caribbean empire evaporated. His influence in Havana was erased almost overnight. To the world he was becoming less a leader and more a symbol, a reminder of a bygone era. Back in Italy he faced both isolation and surveillance. Authorities shadowed him. Newspapers sensationalized him. Rivals observed him, some with respect, others with quiet satisfaction. But even then he refused to become irrelevant. He still held connections to narcotics distribution networks, particularly those linking Europe to America. While he never moved drugs personally, his name and influence helped facilitate routes, negotiate supplier relationships, and maintain a fragile balance among syndicates. But this new field was darker, more unpredictable, and far more dangerous. Narcotics were not like gambling or alcohol. They attracted a different kind of criminal, a younger, more reckless type who lacked Luciano's discipline. He could guide them, but he could not control them. And slowly, as new generations emerged, the criminal world began to evolve in directions he had not intended. Age too changed him. His health began to weaken. Nightclubs and backrooms were replaced by cafes and long walks along the Neapolitan waterfront. He spent afternoons smoking, reflecting on a life that felt both triumphant and tragic. Visitors came and went, some seeking advice, some seeking blessing, some simply wanting to meet the man who had once ruled the American underworld. Luciano welcomed them with a mixture of pride and melancholy. He knew he was becoming a relic, a living legend whose stories were whispered rather than lived. Yet even as his physical world shrank, his mind remained sharp. He understood his place in history, what he had built, what he had changed, and what he had lost. He knew that men like Genovese, Costello, and Lansky continued to shape the underworld in their own ways. He knew that the commission he created still governed the mafia with the system he designed. His blueprint had become the underworld's constitution. And that knowledge gave him a sense of immortality, even as his body aged. But Exile also revealed truths he had long ignored. The power he once possessed had come at a cost. Friendships strained, relationships sacrificed, freedom lost. He realized that leadership isolated him, even among those who admired him. The throne he once sat upon was visible only from a distance now, and he began to see that maybe it had always been lonely. His final years were marked by introspection. He walked the same docks where immigrants once arrived looking for hope, men like him decades earlier. Sometimes he sat quietly, watching the sea roll against the shore, wondering how different his life might have been if he had chosen another path. But regret was not in his nature. Reflection, yes. Regret, no. He understood something profound. Empires crumble, but impact remains. And Lucky Luciano, whether revered, feared, or hated, had reshaped the criminal world forever. On January 26, 1962, Luciano met with a film producer interested in telling his story. He spoke with passion, reliving his triumphs and losses, the rise and fall, the vision and the exile. When the meeting ended and the producer walked away, Luciano stood outside the Naples airport, inhaled deeply and collapsed. His heart, which had carried decades of ambition, conflict and pressure, finally gave out. He died in exile, far from the streets he once ruled. But he died a legend. In the years that followed, criminals studied his methods, governments analyzed his structure, and historians debated his morality. But everyone agreed on one thing. Lucky Luciano was the architect of modern organized crime. His final gambit, building a life and influence in exile, revealed both his genius and his humanity. He had spent his life shaping the world from behind the scenes, and even in his last breath, he remained a man whose legacy echoed louder than his presence.